And joining us now on The Debate in Vancouver, British Columbia, TVO's international affairs analyst, there's Janice Stein. In the nation's capital, Jeffrey Simpson, national affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail. And here in studio, Andrew Coyne, national editor with Maclean's Magazine. Alan Bonner, communications consultant and the author of Political Conventions. William Christian, political scientist and the author of Parkin, Canada's most famous forgotten man. And of course, Waller Newell, political scientist at Carleton and the author of The Soul of a Leader. Good to have everybody here around this table and in Points Beyond. And Jeffrey Simpson, I'd like to start with you. Desiring power is seen as suspect, and yet obviously if these people that we elect didn't desire power, we would be bereft of leaders in this country. So you've seen a lot of them come and go, and I want to start by asking you this. How do we know that those who aspire power want it for the right and legitimate reasons?
Well, we don't really. We try to measure that before elections, and we study their lives before they enter public life to see if that can give us clues as to what they will do once they get into power. I thought Professor Newell made a number of excellent points, one of which was that sometimes leaders do things without fully comprehending what the consequences are. But take, for example, in the Canadian case, Pierre Trudeau. He made many compromises throughout his political career, but he did have a core set of convictions which, if you read what he had written before he entered public life, if you followed him during the Liberal leadership campaign of 1968, you had a sense that these core ideas were going to form a lot of the policies that his government subsequently introduced. I'd like to just say, and Trudeau's not a bad example, one of the criterion I've always used for judging political leaders is this, and Professor Newell alluded to it. If you think 20, 30, 50 years down the road or even longer, what is it that that leader did that has stood the test of time in the sense of becoming part of the warp and woof of their country? And if you think of Mr. Trudeau, he made many mistakes, he made many enemies, and I'm not here to give a hagiographic description of him, but nobody contests today the Official Languages Act in Canada. Nobody questions, I don't think, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, although people sometimes disagree on how courts interpret it, and so on. So that's not a bad matrix, I think, for judging the effectiveness of a political leader. He has to get elected, or she has to get elected. They have to have ambition to enter this arena. They have to want power. You ask the right question, what is it that they want power for? I think you can get some measure of that. And then if you take a longer historical view, you can measure whether in fact what they did has become part of the warp and woof of their country. And that's a pretty good test, I think, of how effective they've been.
I must confess, I read your column every time you publish it, but I don't think I've ever heard you say warp and woof before. That's a new one, Jeffrey. Thank you for sharing that one tonight.
Sorry.
No, that's good. I like it. I like it. Janice, pick up on Jeffrey's comment and the yardstick that he uses for determining really what is what makes for a great leader. And, he talks about footprints. He talks about stuff that lasts, that in some respects can't be overturned. Who gets on your list? Throw a few names out there based on that metric.
I agree with Jeffrey that leaving a footprint is probably the defining characteristic of leadership. I might shade it just a little bit differently and say a leader is somebody who can take a society a place they might not otherwise go. And that's a tough thing to do. Winston Churchill clearly stands tall in this direction. He was a leader at a time when Britain really did not fully understand why it was important to go to war. He's on everybody's list. I think Trudeau is a leader. There's no question about it. In the United States, Lyndon Johnson, not somebody that was on anyone's list really, but somebody who took American society down a path with civil rights legislation that I don't think even at the time Americans fully understood where the end of that path would be. So it's somebody whose commitments, core commitments, and I think this is what Jeffrey was talking about as well, whose core commitments are so strong that despite all the pushing and the hauling of politics and the kind of compromise that you have to make, those core commitments really define and shape the single path that the leader pushes down.
Okay, Alan Bonner, let me go to you with this. You've media trained, you've worked for a ton of leaders over the years. I want to know whether there were any that you worked with who gave you pause, because on the one hand, their ambition to get the job was big, but you wondered and were not altogether comfortable about where they might take that power if they got it.
Well, first of all, two come to mind. One couldn't tell me why it was so important to become leader, and that leadership only lasted a couple of months.
You want to say who that was?
No, of course not. I mean, if you
It'd be so
don't
much
have,
more fun for the rest of us if you would.
if you don't have the substance of why you want to do something that I think that everybody's alluded to, you're not going to have much success. The other one wanted to talk about clothing. And
Well, now you got to tell us who
I'm
that
serious.
one was.
This went on for about an hour, and I said, you know, you're opening up a store, and the store is called Politics, and you've got to have something on the shelf other than haberdashery. But you know, the earlier speakers raised three little points in my mind. One is the vast difference between the American and the Canadian system. The reluctant leader, and there's a famous painting of Washington being entreated to run while sitting on his porch writing letters and contemplating the world. This isn't a Canadian tradition. This is an American tradition in reaction to the divine right of kings. So we're a little different. When Mulrooney played the card that he was a rags to riches, up from nowhere guy, this didn't sound Canadian. To my ear, it sounded American. The oratory that the combination head of state, head of government has is different. On charisma, I like to look at it in terms of power, because nobody could say that Diefenbaker, Thatcher, Chrétien, King, or Nixon had charisma, but they sure did have smarts and power. And then finally, someone alluded to the fact that we don't know where we're going as leaders sometimes. I don't know what I'm coaching a leader for sometimes. The biggest foreign policy issue discussed in the Kennedy-Nixon debates, hotly debated, Kamoy and Matsu never again reared their ugly little heads in history, and so it is the unknown, the unforeseen, the general leadership fitness and the ability to deal with the unknown that counts.
Andrew, how do you deal with that paradox? On the one hand, they have to crave power, they have to want to be in there to do something, to be elected, but on the other hand, it kind of makes us uncomfortable if they want power that much, doesn't it?
Yes, and 'twas ever thus. I mean, think of Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar, where he's very careful to disavow any ambition, says, you know, I don't have the eloquence that others do. It's an old game. You have to make it seem like you don't want it, when everyone can read the code nevertheless. And part of it, I think, we almost want them to engage in the artifice of it. We almost want them to pretend not to want power. But if they genuinely don't want power, we're not going to be that interested in them. So there's a certain theatricality and gamesmanship to it that I think everyone consciously or subconsciously taps into. Look, we want them to want it for the right reasons. And again, I think we're pretty good, all in all, at reading people's motives and reading whether they're in this for reasons of fulfilling some kind of hysterical sense of destiny or because they actually want to change the country. I'll give you examples of the two. One of the most unnerving things that ever came out about Paul Martin was this notion that he had to become prime minister in order to fulfill Daddy's destiny.
Because Daddy didn't.
Because Daddy didn't. Or John Turner's sense of, well, I've always been the top dog. I've always been, I have to do this. I mean, he never said this, but people could read this. Chrétien, there's no doubt Chrétien wanted the job. There's no doubt he would bury several people to get there. But you didn't have the sense that it was essential to his psychological makeup to get there. And I think that's a crucial distinction. People want to see somebody who's comfortable in their own skin, who is secure enough in themselves that, yes, they want to win this, but if they don't win it, it's not going to destroy them.
You know, Jeffrey Simpson started the program by saying, in response to my question, how do they know if they want power for legitimate reasons? He says, you really don't. You do your best to try to figure it out, but you really don't. Have you figured out a trick over the years for determining whether, who wants it for the right reasons and who doesn't?
I don't know about who knows it for the right reasons. About two things I want to pick up on. It's to bury people on the Creighton didn't want to bury people on the way. I think the one thing a great leader has to do is to be prepared to be ruthless. And if he's not prepared to be ruthless, he's not going to be a great leader, and he probably shouldn't be in politics.
What does that mean? Ruthless defined how?
Well, you've got to be prepared to ditch lieutenants. I mean, if you look at Mackenzie King. I mean, Mackenzie King in 1940 said he wasn't going to call Parliament back. Called Parliament back for a day and dissolved it. Mackenzie King had undated resignations that he called forward. What about Churchill? And the bombing of Coventry. I mean, great leaders have to be prepared to do ruthless things. Prepared to do them. They don't want to do them, but they have to be prepared to do them if they're going to be great leaders. Other thing great leaders have to do is be lucky.
Lucky in what respect?
Well, Lyndon Johnson was lucky that John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Oof, that's you sure you want to say that?
Well,
I know you just did, but
yeah. If Lyndon Johnson, if Kennedy had not been assassinated, Lyndon Johnson would not have been a great leader. I mean, his good fortune was that Kennedy's death gave him the chance, to be in the place and time that he was.
because it was consequential at the time.
Consequential to that. And Churchill became a great leader because of the fall of Norway. I mean, great leaders often become great leaders because of historic good fortune. Not good fortune it's not good fortune necessarily, but it's good fortune that they wouldn't be great leaders if that thing hadn't happened.
Let me pick up on your comment about ruthlessness, because many have observed that Trudeau, beyond all of the qualities that we've already talked about here tonight, one of the qualities that he exercised pretty well was a ruthlessness, maybe exhibited in that extremely famous interview he gave in Ottawa during the FLQ crisis and the War Measures Act, which we now call the Just Watch Me speech. And we have a little snippet of that. So let's play that and then we'll come back and chat. Roll tape, please, Michael.
Yes, I think the society must take every means at its disposal to defend itself against the emergence of a parallel power which defies the elected power in this country. And I think that goes to any distance. So long as there's a power in here which is challenging the elected representative of the people, I think that power must be stopped. And I think it's only, I repeat, weak-kneed, bleeding hearts who are afraid to take these measures.
And of course, the reporter Tim Rafe goes on to say, well, just how far would you go? And he says, just watch me. Can we imagine, Walter Newell, a political leader in Canada today? First of all, the optics around all of that. Alan Bonner just said it. You know, a PM giving an impromptu chat on the steps of Parliament to a couple of reporters. That's it. I mean, that would never happen.
The national security crisis.
Exactly. It would never happen. Never happen. But how about talking so disapprovingly about the so-called bleeding hearts? Can you imagine anybody talking that way today in this country?
It's hard. I mean, one thing that's always impressed me about Trudeau was this core sense that he had of what made liberal democracy legitimate. And I think it's something that you can go back to his Cité Libre days. He's consistently a classical Madisonian liberal, and when it comes to the use of force to threaten the legitimacy of the state, he is quite ruthless. And it's a ruthlessness that is disciplined and has a kind of consistency that I think made him very impressive. I think we might underestimate the public. It's possible that a leader today could speak in this fashion. I'm not so sure that it is impossible.
Alan?
Speaking of having to be lucky, had it not been for World War II, Churchill would have gone down in history as on the wrong side of Indian independence, the wrong side of the use of chemical weapons, the author of the disastrous Dardanelles campaign. By the late 30s, he was already known, mid to late 30s, he was known as a crazy old man having drinks at the Carlton Club. The thing that mystifies me about Lincoln is his inability to get General McClellan to defend the North in the opening days of the war between the states. He famously said, if you're not using your army, do you mind if I borrow it for a while? Leadership should have also translated into being able to command his own general, and that's a mystery to me. The final thought that I have is nobody teaches followership. There are these leadership courses you can go to all over creation, famous ones, but nobody's teaching followership.
We're going to pick up on that.
You need followers.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little later. Janice, pick up on the ruthlessness comment, that comment that Trudeau made and the notion of ruthlessness as being integral to being a good leader.
You know, ruthlessness is a quality, very much like several others. It just depends what label you put on it. We could call it determination, we could call it consistency. So actually, it depends very much from which vantage point you're looking at. You know, as Alan and Jeffrey were talking, Nelson Mandela came to mind. Clearly somebody that we consider a great leader, but we wouldn't use the word ruthless to talk about him. We would probably talk about his determination. He's an example of a leader who again took his society down a road in a way that it didn't really expect to go. Wasn't clear what the outcome would be at the time, did it largely with the force of moral power and moral suasion. So ruthlessness from that perspective, I don't think that's a word we would use really to describe Mandela, but we would use the word commitment, determined, focused, visionary.
Jeffrey, let me ask a completely politically incorrect question here, but since everybody around this table seems to agree that there is a, and Walter, you pointed out in your book, in the heart of every great leader, there is a dark place. There is a bit of a Machiavellian place. Here comes the question. Don't shoot me for it. Is that why there are so few women at the highest reaches of leadership in this country and world?
Good question.
Well, back as a preamble to the question of ruthlessness, it was Gladstone, who was the longest-serving British Prime Minister, who said a good Prime Minister has to be a butcher. So now to your question about women. One of the highest-profile women in the last 50 years in a democratic society was Margaret Thatcher, whom I had the opportunity to cover for 3 years. And she, too, at one point used that Gladstonian phrase. Now, is she a great leader? Well, if you use the standard that I did, i.e. things that she did 30 years later that are not going to be changed in the United Kingdom, yes, she was a great leader. The trade union movement has been decimated in the United Kingdom. Privatization spawned 1,000 imitators around the world. Her particular views on certain issues domestically still prevail, the role of the market. But in foreign policy, she was the cold warrior of cold warriors. She stood against sanctions against apartheid in South Africa. We were just speaking about Mr. Mandela. And ultimately, she lost the confidence of all of the senior members of the Conservative Party, whether it was Geoffrey Howe or Nigel Lawson and so on and so forth. And that's ultimately what did her in. So I'm not sure, you know, people looked at Mrs. Thatcher, and I certainly did, and said, you know, she doesn't have some of these qualities, let's put it that way, that are often identified with women, that they're inclusive, that they're collaborative, that they're seeking consensus, that they don't have that kind of political testosterone that men do, that they, you know, the old saying that if you want to have somebody give a speech, ask a man. If you want to get something done, ask a woman. Well, she got things done all right, but she alienated an awful lot of people. And a leader has to have a team. Just one last comment. There's a wonderful book that's come out the last 2 years, a bestseller in the United States, Lincoln's Team of Rivals, by Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yes. Yeah.
And that thesis is arresting, and it's been read by Obama, which is a leader is a leader, absolutely. But a leader has to have people who are working with him, and he has to know how to use them to achieve his objectives. And Lincoln, with rivals, all of whom thought that they ought to be the Republican Party nominee, most of them thought they were smarter and brighter than Lincoln. Many of them quarreled with him when he was president, but he nevertheless brought them in the tent, used them effectively, and helped himself achieve the objectives that he set.
Let's go Andrew Coyne, then William Christian.
Well, just to pick up on Jeffrey's point, I mean, I think that's an illustration also of that self-confidence and that inner reserve of strength, that you're willing to have people around you who are smarter than you or are seen as being smarter than you. You don't feel threatened by that. To come back to the Trudeau clip, you see that self-confidence obviously supremely there. That knowledge of when you have to mollify your opponents and when you just have to draw a line in the sand. And that willingness to draw down different types of political capital. I think there's three different types I'd identify. One is he had some political capital as a noted civil libertarian, that he could, having established that reputation, could go the other direction and people wouldn't think that the world was ending. He was obviously prepared to draw down some of his political capital in terms of popularity. And the third thing in terms of the ruthlessness is, and I think it puts a limit on the ruthlessness, is you also have to have a reputation as being a person of honor and trust and integrity, and you can only bend that so far. The great leaders, yes, could be ruthless when the occasion demanded it, but they picked their spots. The trouble with so many modern politicians in lesser times, shall we say, is they think everything is World War II. They think every Picayune provincial election is wartime, and they wind up making really trivial and petty types of ruthlessness that simply gets them a reputation as a hatchet man and doesn't actually achieve larger goals.
William?
Well, I think we could go, I mean, with Mackenzie King, we could go through Mackenzie King as a case study and probably everything that was good in leadership. But in what you're saying about being surrounded by strong men, I mean, Mackenzie King probably had the strongest cabinets in Canadian history. When somebody strong died, like Ernst LaPlante, I mean, he went and got, you know, Louis Saint Laurent to replace him. I mean, other prime ministers have been frightened to have strong people around him. I mean, Louis Saint Laurent, Mackenzie King only wanted strong people around him because he knew he could handle strong people. And what Jeffrey was saying, the, you know, about being able to control people. I mean, we might argue about whether Brian Mulroney was a great leader. But the one thing I don't think we'd argue about was Brian Mulroney was a great handler of men and women, the great handler of the people in his caucus. And that's why when he was at 9% in the polls, his people in his caucus still loved him.
They were still with him.
They were still with him. And that's because he knew he cultivated them, he talked to them. Hi, how's your wife? You know, I'm sorry your daughter was ill and stuff like that. And I think a great leader, that's what a great leader has to do too. A great leader has to be able to handle his followers and really, and in a sense, care about them. I think Mulroney actually did care about them.
And yet, why was Mulroney ultimately so unpopular? I think part of it was people could sense a neediness in him, that he needed to be loved too much, and that gave people a certain revulsion. And also, I think he made a mistake in his later days of glorying in his unpopularity, and he would take this as a badge of his greatness. Well, look at how unpopular I am. That must show I'm doing something right. I would say not to the contrary. The job of a leader, in my view, is not to do unpopular things necessarily. It's to make the things he does popular. It's to carry the day. It's, as Janice said, to take people where they wouldn't otherwise have gone.
But I've got to go to Janice on this because I haven't heard from her on the issue of women. So, you know, this ruthlessness, this Machiavellian nature that apparently is omnipresent in great male leaders, how about in women leaders?
You know, this is a catch-22 question, Steve, designed to trap no matter what I answer. Let me put the answer this way to you. There's two views on this. David Ben-Gurion, Prime Minister of Israel, famously said about Golda Meir, the best man in my cabinet. And she was a woman, of course. So women certainly have had the capacity at different times to be as tough, as ruthless, as butcher-like in their decision-making as men. Margaret Thatcher clearly had that capacity. The real question is, when they behave much more like women, the stereotype of women, consensus seekers, team builders, collaborators, are they leaders? Unfortunately, we haven't had that many women political leaders, certainly in modern times, that would put that proposition to the test. But I agree that if you can't build a team, the great leaders stay focused on one or two big things that they want done, but surround themselves with a cohesive team of capable people, and they're not threatened by those people. That sounds a lot more like a woman than it does like a man most of the time.
Well, let me follow up with Waller on that. I'll follow up with Waller on that because when we talk leadership, people I think generally think of the man on the white horse leading everybody behind with the followers, as Alan said, and you know, big, tough, strong, physical, all of what goes along with that. We don't think of the person who's going to lead us all to consensus and what will emerge will be a great decision. Do we need to reevaluate our sense of what defines leadership today?
I just have to put this in context by telling a quick anecdote. My wife and I once met Lady Thatcher after she had retired. She proceeded to lecture my wife about how to choose drapery fabric in the same stentorian tones that I imagine she upbraided George H.W. Bush about the need to invade Iraq. She did not lose that commanding air. I totally agree with Janice about the need for focusing on 2 or 3 large goals, and this seems to me to be not gender specific. And I think women leaders are capable of tremendous resoluteness, what one might call masculine qualities. But just to conclude, there could be a certain kind of homeopathic relishing that democratic leaders do feel about their tyrannical foes. I think Churchill had this a bit about Hitler. I think FDR did as well. Nixon had it a bit about the communists, a certain kind of entering into the viewpoint of the despotic leader. And this might actually be a certain useful trait to be able to enter into that psychology while resolutely avoiding its pitfalls for
Alan?
yourself.
I actually find some of the female leaders that I deal with more serious about the job at hand. The men seem to want to get by on a shoe shine and a kiss and a promise. And by the way, because of the abject disappointment of Kim Campbell and Rita Johnson in BC, we tend to think that we are way behind the curve on leaders. Actually, we've had 21 female leaders in the past 10, 15 years, about 21%.
In Canada?
Yeah, party leaders. And now they are usually on the left of center. They're usually shorter lived as leaders than men. That's regrettable. But we are making some progress in that regard. And the latest studies, if I can just finish this, the latest studies are that women aren't looking to women to behave like men in leadership traits, that they are willing to accept gender-specific traits. They are not willing to accept sex role stereotypes, though.
Okay.
Yeah,
Janice, let's go Janice, Jeffrey, and then William.
The good point on that is, yes, we've had women party leaders, but we've had very few elected women premiers and only one elected prime minister. And our representation generally of women in House of Commons and in a lot of our legislatures, we are behind the curve on that. I think the real issue is there is a change in the whole discussion, whether women need to behave like men to be leaders, and the growing consensus is no, that they don't. That, I think, speaks to a bigger question. And you touched on it earlier, Steve, you know, in an era where the internet is such an important part of political life, where communication so much less central than it used to be. There's so many forms of political engagement now beyond political parties. The kinds of qualities, the consensus builder, the network builder, the team builder, these, I think, are growing important parts of leadership, and they are skills that women do have.
Jeffrey Simpson.
Well, the only Western democratic country being run by a woman at the moment is Germany, and we're all thinking of Germany these days because of the end of the Berlin Wall. Angela Merkel has handled a coalition there, because German governments are all coalition governments, with exceptional dexterity and skill. Nobody thought that she would emerge to lead the Christian Democratic Party, and she did so, and she's held the coalition together, and she won another election. She's tough. I try to follow German politics fairly closely, and she's one tough cookie. And the people who've crossed her in the CDU, and there were lots of barons in the party, found out to their regret just how tough she was. Does that mean she's having to conduct herself in a more male way? I don't know. It's just in politics you have to be very decisive and sometimes very difficult, and she's been. Just on the point of Germany, this was a country after the Second World War that was absolutely devastated. I don't know if you'd say their leaders were great, but they've certainly had three very good leaders. Adenauer had a strong conviction that Germany should be anchored in the West. Helmut Schmidt had a strong conviction of the same kind, and also that the Social Democratic Party needed to modernize itself. Helmut Kohl had the tremendous vision, the tremendous sense when the wall came down to embrace unification with both of his mighty arms and girth. Now, he made mistakes in the way in which it was done. I won't go through some of them. They've been picked over by German historians, but he seized the moment.
William Christian.
Yeah, I think there are two things that you have to distinguish between. One is consensus, which is what we often think of women politicians, or it's often attributed. This was often attributed to women politicians as their style of building, the other is a kind of thing that often some male politicians have done. Trudeau did it, and again, I hate to harp on Mackenzie King, but he did it again in a supreme way, which was to consult, but not necessarily to try to build consensus. I mean, the one thing Mackenzie King did, by all accounts, was that people could go into Mackenzie King. They would state their point of view, and they would leave feeling absolutely confident that Mackenzie King understood what they had said.
It's one thing for a society to create great leaders. Society, in order to create great leaders, also needs to create great followers. Do we do that in Canada?
Not in the slightest. I mean, we have a culture that has empowered everyone. Everyone's half-baked idea holds the same status as everybody else's half-baked idea, and the facts. You don't even have to have the facts. It's just to have a well thought out opinion, fervently held opinion. And what we need is more followership. People who can take orders, like in the military. Nelson Mandela was mentioned earlier. I think I'm paraphrasing him correctly when I say he said he was often like the shepherd. He might have been following all of his flock, but he was still the leader. A leader sometimes needs to pick an emergent leader for a particular task, get out of the way so that a team or a group can perform a task, realize that he or she is not always the right person for a particular task. And this is not discussed very much. Everything is how can you be the bombastic, two-fisted leader, whether you're a man or a woman, or whether you're using charisma or any other thing. Sometimes consensus isn't needed. Sometimes action is needed. In the time it takes some meetings in either industry and government, to decide something, you can go over to the corner and do it.
Waller Newell, you can't say, though, today and get elected, excuse me, we need better followers in this country. You can't do that, can you?
No, but I think it would be possible to treat the public as somewhat more capable of understanding complex public issues. I think one of Obama's great virtues is this. I think the jury's out on a lot of his initiatives, but I mean, he did hit the ground running. He presented rather very large policy visions to the country, and he did this entirely up front. And I think that one thing that we sometimes underestimate is the public's capacity to have policies explained to them. Again, going back to Lincoln, Lincoln's style was dry and pedantic. Except for a few memorable phrases, he rarely was a person who spoke golden words, but he was capable of explaining things to the public in a coherent way. This seems to be something that we could still aspire to.
Well, could I say something about that? Because Lincoln, of course, is revered by all, but the Lincoln-Douglas debates were 6 hours long. I know the Gettysburg Address was short, but most of the debates were long. The favorable newspapers would reprint in totem what Lincoln said and all the other leaders in their day. Now, the press was very partisan. Today, you're lucky if you get 8-second clip on the national news, and that is the principal means by which people get their information in our country. As somebody who's been writing columns for a long period of time now, I often despair about the ability of the public to understand these complicated matters that Professor Newell was talking about. I'll give you an example today. If you read my email box every day, and I don't counsel you doing it, you would see a disheartening number of people who simply don't accept the science of climate change. The scientific community around the world is almost unanimous. There are some dissenters. And yet I hear constantly from people who are in touch with me that sunspots are causing this, or that there is some million-long-year cycle that's causing this, or that we don't know what the reason is. And you kind of despair about this. And in the modern media, where we have this attention span of a gnat, because of not shows like this, but most of our conventional broadcasting, I despair about the ability of people to really come to grips with complex issues.
Andrew,
I really want to differ. I want
Andrew.
to differ with both Jeffrey and Alan on this, and maybe side with Waller on this. I think public education and public involvement in these issues is a function of how much responsibility they're given. If you treat them like children, they'll become children. If you treat them like adults, I think they step up. I'll give you a couple of examples. The free trade election. It took people a long time to click in that they were going to have to actually make this decision. I remember I was working for the Financial Post at the time, a business newspaper. We'd been writing about nothing but free trade for a year and a half, and we were getting people phoning us up 3 weeks before the election saying, what's all this about free trade? But I do think you saw a national cram session that went on in that. It was messy, it was ugly, but I think people did step up.
Janice Stein, go ahead.
You know, it's interesting because if you put out a job advertisement for followers, you wouldn't get very many applicants in the world in which we live. And I think that's partly because of the media that we have. Jeffrey's right, I'm sure you must get some appalling emails. But if you actually look at the dispersal of the news media, the way people get information, the fragmented nature of it, I don't think it's correct to say that people know less. I think they just know very differently. And to that extent, they do step up on issues that really matter to them, and the level of engagement is not less than it's been in the past. So the real question is, what relationship do we want with our leaders?
Steve,
do we
no-
want to give them a long leash, trust their judgment, trust that they're better informed than we are because that's what we're focused on? Or do we want them on a short leash where we're pulling them back all the time and saying, come explain to us, and then we'll decide whether you're empowered to go ahead
Okay,
with this
let me
or
get
not.
Alan and William in.
No
before we're-
surprise to anyone that to a person, the political leaders and candidates that I speak to say exactly what Jeff Simpson just said. You can't boil it down into 8 seconds, et cetera, et cetera. I say, number one, I can find 40-second clips even on radio stations and on TV stations. There is time. Number two, if you can't boil your position on an issue down into a 750-word op-ed piece, 5 minutes on a morning radio program, even a 10, 15-second clip, you probably don't have a very clear position. The mysteries of life are boiled down into aphorisms in the Bible and the Koran and the Talmud and other great books, and you're telling me that what you're doing in the ministry of something really boring is so complex that you can't say it in a couple of sentences? I don't buy it at all. They're just lazy.
I'm not sure about that. I read a biography I wrote is Sir George Parkin, who's Michael Ignatieff's great-grandfather. Parkin gave 2-hour speeches in places like Barrie and Orillia in front of 500 people, and they were riveted by that. I mean, Edward Blake gave a 5-hour speech in the House of Commons and brought down MacDonald's government over the Pacific Railway. I mean, Gladstone gave a 4-hour speech over the Armenian massacres, and people stood in the rain listening to him give them. I mean, these were people who were educators. These were people who explained complexities of politics to people who are far less educated than we are today.
Are you recommending that as the way to go today?
Yes.
You are. How many politicians could get elected giving 5-hour speeches today? Who'd show up and listen to them?
Fidel Castro.
Castro's the only guy, and I
train
don't
them.
think he had to win too many elections. and Connor's
How
gonna
long
try.
has he been in power?
We could have television debates, for example, where they had to sustain an argument for 10 minutes, shall we say?
Yes.
Yeah,
Rather than
instead of
just
shouting
blurting it out in
matches.
20
And
seconds.
they could work
Go
up
ahead.
from there.
30 seconds. Last 30 seconds to
Stephen.
Jeff Simpson. Go ahead.
One of the best metaphors I ever heard for political leadership came from Theodore H. White, who wrote The Making of the President's books. Andrew Cohen just made reference to John Kennedy. He said, this is an American metaphor, a leader has to be like the guy at the top of head of a wagon train who goes up to the top of the mountain and sees what's over on the other side, and then tries to persuade those who are following him that it's worth going up the cliff, suffering all the indignities and difficulties of getting there, trying to solve their quarrels and their aches, and getting them to the top. It's a romantic view, it's an American view, but I think it has a core kernel of truth.
That's nicely put and a great way to end our discussion tonight. Thanks out of town in Vancouver to Janice Stein from the Munk Center, Jeffrey Simpson, National Affairs columnist of the Globe and Mail in the nation's capital. Great to have both of you on the line with us tonight. Andrew Coyne, Maclean's Magazine, William Christian, the professor of political science, retired. On the other side of the table, Alan Bonner, Political Conventions, Waller Newell, The Soul of a Leader. Great reads, both. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your participation.